Welcome back, everybody. Now, I'm hoping most of you were here this morning to see the excellent keynote from Professor Voss, and you saw the charts, and you saw that how positive thinking comes back perfectly after a meal. So I'm hoping to benefit from that sentiment from you all now. This panel is going to be talking about how competition authorities should respond to artificial intelligence. Now, I probably don't need to spend an awful lot of time talking to you about what AI is. I'm sure that you know since November 2022, when ChatGPT launched, there's been an awful lot of fanfare, a lot of movements. Most of you probably use it, or at least you're aware of it. Across the OECD, an awful lot of work is being undertaken to understand both the benefits, but also potential risks regarding artificial intelligence, ranging from privacy to ethical, maybe even labor market concerns. Across the House, a lot of work has been undertaken, including an OECD recommendation on artificial intelligence, which sets out a series of AI principles for sort of a human-centric, trustworthy AI, as well as work on an AI policy observatory, which you can find online and is a really fantastic resource to track policy responses to AI across the world, not just within the OECD. But we're here today to talk about competition, and I hope I'm not alone in the room in saying that competition is a force that we want to promote. And I think AI technology is an area where that is equally true. So why competition in AI? Well, given the potential for the technology to have benefits, we don't quite know exactly what those benefits will be just yet, but it's important that as a potential technology, competition is a driving force to help ensure that it's as widely adopted as possible, good quality, low prices, but also the innovation incentives remain, and that it is the best models that win out, and there aren't other factors that are impeding the ability of others to compete. In that guise, the OECD Competition Committee held a session last June, really reflecting on how competition may evolve, and it really focused on generative AI and sort of how the market could evolve from the perspective of competition and what authorities might do. So that will be the focus of today's session. However, there are a couple of other topics you might think are relevant when you consider competition and AI. Another one could be how AI as a technology that allows people to interact with predictive power in ways that previously maybe you needed a computer science degree to do, could have on markets across the economy. Maybe it will change the way firms set prices. Maybe it will change the way in which consumers interact with competitors, interact with firms. Perhaps there's an element to which they might use them as agents. That's another way it might be interesting. And finally, perhaps authorities themselves might think about AI as a technology they can use to do their jobs on a day-to-day better. Now, we're going to try to focus the conversation on the first part of that discussion, but if we have time, we'll hopefully get a little bit into those other two areas as well. In the Competition Committee, we will be holding upcoming discussions on a number of these areas, including a session in just a couple months on cloud computing, which is obviously a relevant area as well. So I'm not going to spend too long monopolizing the discussion. We have a fantastic panel, which I'll introduce in a moment, but just very quickly, a few insights from a paper that was written to support that session last June, just to help set the scene a little bit. The first is just a value chain, which is taken directly from the paper, and if you're interested, you can see the QR code in the top right or left. It's getting a bit confusing how I'm looking at it. To me, it's top right. But you can access the paper there. But this essentially just sets out a very simplistic view of the market for generative AI, and I should say this was published nearly a year ago, so of course things continue to evolve. But the things I would highlight is just the different elements of the chain where you have the key underpinning foundational models, then perhaps a series of refinement or fine-tuning, especially if it would be to be an open source model. And then, importantly, the deployment. And the deployment may be slightly different depending on whether it's to an organization, which might want to integrate it to a series of their systems, productivity software, etc., versus a user where you might just want a chatbot and you might want to make a few queries on an ad hoc basis. Now, a number of inputs are highlighted at the top, sort of computing, know-how, and data, and obviously those have implications for finance. Another one of the key insights from the paper, which I just want to very quickly draw on, was that it raised a number of potential competition risks. The paper didn't give any particular opinion on whether these were likely to come to fruition, but it merely highlighted three sort of categories to be aware of. The first was concerns that these key inputs, the compute, the data, the know-how, might be difficult to access, and that could create barriers to entry in the future. Similarly, there were concerns that there might be difficulties for future entrants to access users, perhaps due to them being locked into an ecosystem or for switching costs. And finally, it considered the fact there might be some structural issues in the market, perhaps exacerbated by partnerships, that might make it a little bit difficult for competition to flourish. It made a final comment just to note that all of the developments in generative AI take place in the context of digital markets that have evolved over the recent decades, and that there might be concentration in certain elements, and that could affect how competition evolves. So today we're going to focus on a little bit on how competition might evolve. Obviously, we've been following developments, and we see there's upcoming work from members of the OECD that tracks how prices have evolved in upcoming, not quite yet on the slide, over recent years, and they show how prices have evolved for quality, and that work will come out in the next months, and it will show how prices have reduced over time for quality, which is quite interesting. We also have developments recently, just a few weeks ago, with DeepSeek purporting to change the dynamics of the models. Now, who knows quite exactly the reality, but it's clear that the technology is continuing to evolve and that it is a dynamic space. So we're going to focus on the role of competition authorities, and now I want to just draw your attention to this slide, which is an attempt that I've made to try to just draw some of the activities that have been taking place from authorities. Now, I want to be very clear that I do not pretend this is exhaustive. I'm sure, and if I've missed out your authority, please accept my apologies. But you can see how, sort of starting from 2023, a number of authorities have been undertaking a series of activities. Very loosely, these can be categorized into sectoral inquiries, call for contributions, market studies, policy papers, issues papers of types, as well as some joint statements, which have obviously occurred between the EU, UK, US, some blog posts, and a number of different activities in the merger space. There are lots of different merger cases that I haven't tried to fit in here. The point I want to make is that this is an area where competition authorities are already doing quite a few things. So today we want to really dive into whether they're doing the right things, whether they should be doing more, and maybe to reflect a little bit on their experience. To help me do that, I'm joined by a fantastic panel today. Starting on the far side, we have Karen Croxson, who's the Chief Data Technology and Insight Officer at the UK's Competition and Markets Authority. And since the side's still up, you'll see that the CMA has been quite a full leader in this area, so that's a fantastic that you could join us today, Karen. Thibault, who's the Associate Professor of Law at VU Amsterdam and a faculty affiliate at Stanford University. And then finally, last but not least, in any stretch, Cecilia Rikap, who's an Associate Professor of Economics at UCL, but also heads their Research Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. So, as is traditional in the open day, and as following the excellent example of my colleague, I want to start off by bringing the audience into the discussion with a few quick polls. And there are only 2 questions, and I'm going to ask you to answer them both at the beginning. So if you could do your usual thing and find your QR codes, or alternatively go to menti.com and you can use the code in there. And we have just 2 very simple questions for you today. First, in the next 3 to 5 years, how competitive do you think the generative AI will be? And I want you to assume that competition authorities are not doing a lot. So let's preclude, obviously they will do a lot, perhaps, but let's assume that they're not there. The second question that I'd like you to consider is, how much of a priority do you think that generative AI should be for competition authorities? And again, a very simple set of answers: high, medium, or little to none. So again, I encourage you to go to your QR code, and then we will just get up the answers to the first question before we start with the first part of the discussion. I'm going to turn to the panel in a moment to ask them to share their views on how they think competition will evolve and how they see the competitive landscape. Then we're going to try to drill into what competition authorities are doing, should be doing, before finally trying to get, if we have some time, talking about those other areas of how it might affect competition in other markets, and as a tool, how it can be useful for authorities. I will try my best to give time for questions at the end, and also if you're following online, you can put questions into the chat, and we will, if we have time, try to answer those as well. So we see the results coming in live. It's quite exciting, relatively close. Prevailing view seems to be somewhat competitive, with not too far off saying highly competitive, so I would say we were optimistic. Clearly, the Professor Voss line of being optimistic after lunch is true. Maybe we should wait to see if things change at the end of the session. But then a decent proportion, maybe say a fifth thinking that it won't be competitive. So clearly, the perfect result, there is room for discussion. I'm not sure what I would have done if there wasn't, but thankfully there is. So without further ado, I want to turn to the panel. And Cecilia, I want to start with you and hear your thoughts on this. I mean, in a world where there are constant developments with AI and lots of new models and prices are changing, do you have any concerns about competition? Is there anything we should be thinking about in terms of that landscape over the next 3 to 5 years?
Thanks, Richard, and hi, everyone. I think that the results of the poll clearly illustrates that we have an issue in how we define a generative AI market. And my guess is that for those of you that see more competition coming, it's because you are looking at what I would describe as the narrow market. So you're just looking at what's going on at the level of the models. And the fact that we see, for instance, a company from China like DeepSeek developing an AI model that is competitive, it's not leapfrogging, it's not a different technology, but it has then a more efficient use of the existing technology out there, and that other companies seem to be popping up in different parts of the world that are developing LLMs, that are developing generative AI, leads us to think, hey, in the end, there was not an issue with competition. But if instead we take an ecosystems or value chain view, and we'll look not only at the capacity to code an LLM, to develop an algorithm, but actually we see together these strict complementarities between data, code, and compute, and how data and compute are concentrated in the same companies that also are part of the companies that have the capacity to develop LLMs, because they have also been concentrating AI talent. And here in particular, I'm speaking of US big tech, but also secondarily of Chinese big tech companies. And if we add also to this picture that it's not just about having the ingredients for the recipe, but also about having a place where the model can be sold, and this place is the cloud. The cloud is, I sometimes call it the digital supermarket, the digital technology supermarket. But as a matter of fact, it's an incomplete analogy, because unlike any other product, AI and digital technologies more in general, what happens with them on the cloud is not just training, it's not just access to hardware. Actually, the whole production process, the exchange and the consumption takes place inside the cloud. And the cloud is a highly concentrated global market with 3 companies concentrating almost 70% of the market. And these 3 companies do not develop technologies that can interoperate among themselves. It's the same startup is developing a model in one of them, let's say Microsoft. They cannot just automatically be offering it on Amazon or Google. So if we start looking from an ecosystems perspective, what I see is the more startups develop AI models, the more startups develop applications with the AI models, all this will become cheaper, but all this will be sold on their cloud. So we will get more traffic on the cloud, more adoption of AI everywhere at every type of organization, not only companies, also states, universities, hospitals, individuals. And the more we are using AI and the more AI is being developed and the more companies like DeepSeek and others are developing AI solutions, the more Amazon, Microsoft, and Google profit and further entrench their position at the core. I will finish this first intervention saying that for me, this illustrates a pattern of innovation that is neither Schumpeter Mark I, so the entrepreneurs, that the free entrepreneurs, the small startup companies entering and exiting, nor Schumpeter Mark II. Schumpeter Mark II is supposed to be the pattern of innovation where we have just a few companies concentrating the innovation. This is a mix. This is a stable core with a turbulent periphery of thousands of organizations that contribute to produce the knowledge that then all together makes the digital world, the digital services we all consume, but the companies at the core are the ones that are disproportionately profiting. So unfortunately, my answer is that without regulation, without taxing, without building alternatives, I see less competition in the future.
Okay, thank you for that opening gambit, Cecilia. That's laying down a pretty strong marker for the rest of the conversation. I mean, clearly a sense that it's important not to think just about models and we must look at the broader ecosystem. Now, Thibault, I want to move to you. Do you, well, firstly, what's your take on the question, and do you share the view that we must look at this from a broader ecosystem perspective? And I guess, given your take on that, what does it mean for how you see competition evolving?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here with fellow academics and enforcers. I think it's the kind of discussion we need to have. I'm going to try my very best not to answer your question, because I have a very poor track record in terms of making predictions. So whatever I would choose on the graph will probably be proven to be wrong. What I want to do, though, is to try to see and explore in 2 minutes what are the variables and the metrics that we should observe today to anticipate whether or not we are taking the direction of the space being very competitive or medium or not competitive at all. And I would argue that, and this is me answering one of your two questions, that I very much share the same view that we need to have a look at ecosystems. And the reason why we need to have a look at Gen AI as being an ecosystem where you have the infrastructures, the foundation models, the apps, and the users is because it makes that a very complex kind of stack where the dynamics are very hard to anticipate. And there is a quote that I like a lot, and it goes this way: for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And I think this is exactly what you get in the space if you want to come with simplistic solutions to ensure that we see competition in the space. So I'll give you a couple of those simplistic solutions that we hear here and there. One may be that all of the AI partnerships between the big tech companies and the small tech companies are all good because it enables all the small companies to flourish, or they're all bad because it is actually diminishing competition. I think it's too simplistic. We hear as well that all you need in the space is to ensure that the flow of data between the players is actually quite high, because all you need is data, or all you need is access to compute or talent. Sure, you need that, but I doubt that any of those variables on their own will define who will eventually end up winning the market. We hear that there is concentration at the chip layer, with NVIDIA and maybe other companies showing very high and strong market shares. But here again, as I will try to explain later on, I think that if you consider all the layers, you see that it is important to document what is being done at the model layer, because it has impact on the chip and the compute power that you do need to acquire. We hear as well that all you need is to enforce the AI Act. And in fact, we have a beautiful piece of regulation, indeed, the AI Act, a couple of 100 pages long. And this will be enough to ensure competition in the space, although the AI Act was not primarily about competition law. Or that maybe what you need is to make and create an 11th category in the GMA for those CPS, the core platform service, and that 11th category will be Gen AI. And if we can do that, then we are sure and guaranteed to get competition in the space. I think it's also too simplistic, but the other side of the coin is the argument going this way. Well, we see competition today in 2025. It's hard to argue there is no competition. Therefore, we shouldn't do anything at all. Because if we do something, we will mess up with the entire ecosystem, and this will be actually a type 1 error. I think it's also too simplistic. So instead, what I'm going to try to argue, and the point I want to make on this panel, is that there are concepts and variables and metrics that we can use today, not just best guessing what may happen, but that we may observe today, and those comes from the most part from complexity science. And I will just give you a flavor of one of those concepts, and that's the one of increasing returns. The idea being that the more we produce, the cheaper it becomes, or the easier it becomes to attract new users. This is exactly what we see with online technologies. This is exactly what we see with generative AI. And so if we try to measure and capture increasing returns and document those, I would argue that then we're going to be in a very good position to actually start documenting and understanding what are the dynamics and whether or not we are moving in a direction which would be the third one, where we see very little competition, which is not the one that we want. So that would be, again, me trying not to answer your question, and I hope I did a good job at that.
Did you do a good job not answering my question? We'll get there. We'll get there. For Karen, let me turn to you now. And obviously, we saw from the opening slide that the CMA has undertaken quite a lot of work in this area. So maybe you could share your reflections based on that work, but also based on what you've heard from Cecilia and Thibault. What do you take as the, sort of the risks, but also maybe the opportunities from AI?
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard, and just say, huge thank you to the OECD for staging this terrific event today. It's a wonderful opportunity to share a little about our thinking, and a bit of framing and perspective is probably what I'll start with. It was also really interesting to see the poll, and thank you for characterizing some of our contributions in this space as well, Thibault. So, we are the UK's principal competition and consumer protection authority. It's a whole economy role. The job is to make markets work well, and what we mean by that is really promoting competition, ensuring effective choice, tackling any unfair behavior. So we want thriving, positive outcomes from these competitive markets. Now, we all know that we're living through a period of enormous technological change. It's really important, we feel, to lean into this proactively, also very positively, and not shy away from it. Really look to get the opportunities flowing for a prosperous, vibrant economy of the future with really positive outcomes for all. Now, AI in particular, the focus of this panel, of course, it has the potential to be a game changer. We've heard references to the predictive power. There's also the ability to generate natural language, which itself, in some contexts and use cases, is a game changer, and we just haven't been there before societally, and it's sort of raising deep questions. It's also already transforming some areas of our lives, so I won't go into examples at this point, but many will probably come to mind already for people in this room. But of course, there's more potential to come, potential to unleash productivity, unleash growth, drive better outcomes for end users and consumers as well. We could be seeing as yet unimagined innovation in some really exciting areas across the whole economy. So, what's our sort of orientation into this? I think we've invested a lot in understanding the technology, understanding the markets around that, considering, reflecting our mandate, how competition and consumer protection can really help realize and maximize the AI opportunity for the UK. There are many stakeholders to consider, and this speaks a little bit, I think, to the ecosystem approach, the systems thinking approach. Firms looking to develop these technologies, those looking to deploy them in interesting ways across markets to generate value, and of course the end users and consumers. It's a really complex picture. It's moving very quickly. If we want the UK to really tap fully all of this potential, it's going to take companies, businesses of all shapes and sizes across multiple sectors. It's going to take their innovation. It's going to take investment, collaboration, a lot of grit and determination and creativity. And of course, working alongside expertise in academia, in civil society, think tanks and wider groups as well. Coming to competition, we see competition as really key to all of this. It's about creating a diverse market where these healthy rivalries are what are driving innovation and creativity, channeling that into the fruitful directions, and consumers then able to benefit downstream from a wide array of choice in products and services, perhaps meeting needs, removing matching frictions in ways hitherto not possible. And then coming to consumers and the protection side of things, of course, that's important too. Consumers need to know that they'll get a fair deal in these markets. They need to have trust and confidence, and that in turn drives investor trust and confidence. It underpins investment, adoption, and growth. And so there's a role for everyone in our view: the incumbents, the challengers, the global giants, the dynamic, scrappy startups. And I think you'll see that the UK government's recently published AI Opportunities Action Plan also reflects this ecosystem approach. And we're looking at how we can support that in aspects of that as it's rolled out. So then what is our approach? Where are we at today? Well, I've reflected on how this is really such a fast-paced, innovative market. So therefore, we don't believe that heavy-handed, sweeping regulation would be right for the UK. We feel there's a risk that that could slow innovation, that could stunt growth. So we've been investing in expertise and capability, as I mentioned, really trying our best to take a forward-looking view of developments, both the risk, but also these enormous opportunities, making sure that we're engaging a wide array of stakeholders proactively, and crucially, that including then firms, investors, direct engagement, listening, engaging to understand real-world experience of those out there unleashing and investing in these innovations. You mentioned some of our work. We've produced over the past year or so 2 in-depth reports where we have analyzed developments. We've also taken a value chain approach, very aligned with Richard, the OECD's approach that you shared there, and looking there across infrastructure, the development layer, the release layer, down into deployment and that consumer experience, both business and retail consumers. And we're really looking to support the market proactively. So we've published a set of principles to help guide the markets towards positive outcomes. Very briefly, we've got 6 principles. The first is access, and that's upstream. It's about ongoing ready access to these critical inputs, reference, things like data, compute, and expertise. We want to see diversity in the model layer, diversity of a variety of models available. We want to see choice, the ability to switch around, potentially to multi-home, to avoid lock-in to a particular ecosystem. Of course, goes with the territory. We want to see fair dealing, no anti-competitive self-preferencing, tying or bundling. We think transparency is really important. We want users to be able to understand and have information about risks and limitations of these models, because of course there always will be some. And then we want to see broad-based accountability across the value chain. Now, we've discussed these principles with firms and other stakeholders in some quite extensive engagement, and the reaction has been very positive. We've been encouraging firms to embed these principles in their business practices, and we see that as a more efficient way to get to better outcomes than jumping in too early or waiting until competition is undermined. Reflects a little the balance that's been touched upon. But of course, it's not just about principles. We've been reflecting on how we do our work. We know that really matters. We've been engaging stakeholders extensively. We've heard very clearly that 4 particular aspects matter a lot for business and investor confidence: pace, proportionality, predictability, and our process, really making sure we're engaging directly with business. And Sarah Cardell, our CEO, many of you will have met Sarah, has outlined important commitments in this space, and we've begun delivering on them with some rapid, meaningful changes, starting with merger control, but also progressing at pace into other areas. And then just to end by saying that our new digital markets regime has proportionality really baked in at its heart, but also inherent in the design are these 4 Ps together. And this is going to enable us to promote competition in fast-moving digital markets, really respond to some of the complexity and the fast-moving elements, while protecting UK consumers and businesses from any unfair or harmful practices by the very largest technology firms.
Thank you very much, Karen. The brilliant overview of what's happening in the UK. I guess before we move on to the next part of the discussion to explore in a bit more detail what authorities are doing and should be doing, I want to turn back to a few of the points that Cecilia and Thibault made, as well as you, Karen. I guess trying to pull together a few of the different strings. I guess Thibault set out his model of thinking about things in terms of increasing returns to scale, and he also mentioned partnerships and how we shouldn't look at them simplistically. Cecilia, how do you, thinking about the warnings you set out in terms of thinking about the sort of concentration in the cloud, how do you see that within the framework of what Thibault set up? And then, if I may as well, also, what does that mean for what you think about how we should be thinking about partnerships in this space?
Sure. I will start with partnerships because I want to make also a sort of distinction. We are very much used to discuss about the partnerships between, let's say, a big tech and Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and a startup. Of course, the case of Microsoft and OpenAI comes to the fore, but there are many more now. And I've been looking at corporate venture capital from these companies and how they are controlling more and more startups. And what we see there clearly is not only that they have a capacity to control beyond ownership, part is with corporate venture capital, but sometimes it's just with cloud credits, these cloud vouchers that end up locking in the startups and making them build all their architecture and then not only depend on the services that they are purchasing on the cloud to operate, but also then sell the service on the cloud. So of course, for these companies, they will embrace the fact that the cloud exists. And this is a challenge for competition and market authorities, because perhaps for the first time in history, those that are supposed to be challengers don't want to challenge. They're happy with their position because they know this is the best game they can play. And this will perhaps later lead me to what can be done about it. But before that, I want to turn it into the conversation a bit into another type of partnership that I think goes more unnoticed. And this is the partnership among those at the top. And there are two types there. One is what I would describe as a network cartelization among NVIDIA, TSMC, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. All these companies occupying different parts of the AI global value chain are developing technology that is co-specialized. They are what I would describe as intellectual monopolists, because what they monopolize is not necessarily markets, but the knowledge, the technology that is necessary to lead. They do so by appropriating from many others that are producing that knowledge, but then they go and discuss these strategic alliances among themselves to develop technology that fits better with each other and that raises barriers for every potential competitor. And the third type, which is still part of this strategic partnerships among those at the top, is what's happening when AI and digital technologies are adopted beyond the tech sector. Think of Toyota, of IKEA, of Total, or LVMH. Since we are here in France, for instance, we can continue naming leading corporations, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, all these companies, big pharma companies, they are all turning more and more into AI and digital technologies, and they are doing it signing strategic agreements with an Amazon, Microsoft, or Google. And I can come back to this later on, but I think that this is a major challenge for competition and markets authorities, because these are forms of collusion amongst those at the top that further reinforce their capacity to control beyond ownership many other actors in the system and profit from them. We were speaking before about the potential of AI in terms of economic growth. If we have intellectual monopolization, those profiting and concentrating the potential benefits will only be a few, and we will be living, well, in the society we live today, which is mostly a stagnant society.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Thibault, maybe I'll try again if I can get you to answer the question. But I guess maybe a bit more specifically, focusing on this framing that you've helpfully set out around increasing returns to scale, what do you see, in that framing, what do you see as the current landscape, and what do you see that would be for partnerships? You've said that it's not simplistic. Do you have any sort of views on what type of things people might be looking for?
Sure. So this one is not a prediction, so I'm going to try to answer your question. So what I think is very important to keep in mind is that if you try to avoid the lack of nuance that we see sometime in the space, it doesn't mean that the analysis will be so complicated that it will be impossible for any competition agencies to do anything with it. And so coming back to this idea of increasing return, and to answer your question on the partnerships, I think it's a very important concept in trying to capture the dynamics and in maybe putting on the side some partnerships that will be pro-competitive, and on the other side, some partnerships that may be more problematic. So let me explain. Not all increasing returns are born equal. There are a bunch of increasing returns. You've all heard about network effect. It's one of them. You have the learning effect, maybe not so high in the space for reasons we can explore. So you have a bunch of those increasing returns, and if you put them all on the table and try to see what they mean for AI, what you will soon notice is that some of them will actually lead to increase the quality of the foundation model, right? So in the context of AI partnership, this might be, for instance, being a small model provider and getting access to an ecosystem where, in fact, as Cecilia mentioned, you have a lot of app developers that are developing compatible applications on top of that ecosystem. So if you can access that, this will give you access to an ecosystem of app developers with compatibilities. You're going to learn from those, and your model will be increased because of that partnership. So I would say in that case, it may be hard to argue that we do not want the partnerships, because without it, the target won't be in a position to increase the quality of the model as fast as it may with the partnership. However, you also have other types of increasing returns, such as integrating an ecosystem and benefiting from the reputation of the large tech company or the player with whom you are entering into a partnership. I mean, this is good for a business perspective, but it does nothing to increase the quality of the model that you are providing with. And so in that case, I would argue that it could be more problematic to indeed give the green light to a partnership that eventually will reduce the competitive pressure between those two players without putting the target in a position to benefit from a better model at the end of the day, which will eventually increase competition. So this is a clear way to use increasing returns, not as the whole analysis in the space, but as one of the elements that you may want to consider. And if you take a step back, going back again to this idea of different layers and trying to understand the interactions between those layers and how freezing one of those layers may or not impact the other layers, let me give you two examples. One that you mentioned, Richard, is the one of DeepSeek. That Chinese model that relies on open source, and I will talk about open source maybe later on. What we see is that that model actually relies on a sort of a different technology. I don't want to be too technical, but basically that model's, every time you prompt the system and for the purpose of the training, is not relying on the whole data to come up with an answer, but is relying on the data that is relevant to the prompt. So you have decision trees, different branches, and within those you have specific training, right? And the outcome of that is that it is much, much cheaper to develop such a model than it is to develop a big one. I mean, reportedly, OpenAI is spending about $1 trillion to develop GPT-5. Those are not the exact numbers, but this is what is reported in the press. And DeepSeek, I mean, I've seen different numbers between, let's say, $5 and $40 million, but this is way different. So it shows that if that is true, then the need to rely on the chips is actually decreasing, which is why the day DeepSeek was publicized, you see the market cap of NVIDIA decreasing, because suddenly there is no such a need to get access to all the chips that we thought would be necessary in the future. So that's one way. Another example that I want to bring here and put on the table is the one of AlphaMind. AlphaMind is a technology developed by Google, where basically what they do is that they use AI to actually design better chips. So if you are indeed in a position to do so, it may enable you to then have less need at the chip layer because you are increasing your capacity at the foundation model layer. So it again shows the interaction between those two layers. And it goes the other way around. It could be that those interactions lead to concentration, which may be the sign that you do need to do something as a competition agency. And to come back to that ecosystem view, and I will finish on that, if you are using a foundation model on top of which you have many apps available, this will attract users, which in turn will attract more app developers to benefit from that big user base and also compatibility with the other apps, which may lead to concentration. And this is what you see in market with very high increasing returns. They tend to take the form of oligopolies and concentration. Now, the question is whether or not this is problematic, and it is not necessarily, because you may have a very competitive oligopoly, but at least it begs to put on the side this idea that we need to look at AI in the form of rivalry and count how many players there are on the market. Because, and this will be one of my predictions, we'll see about this one in a couple of years, but the early signs are showing that there is concentration, at least at the foundation model layer. And in fact, if we were to ask the people in the room, how many are using OpenAI or Claude or Mistral, because we are in France, probably the big majority would be. And I doubt that you are using one of the hundreds of thousands of models that are available on Hugging Face, right? So we see concentration, but the big question is whether or not it is a competitive kind of concentration. And again, increasing return is a way to answer that question, as opposed to rivalry, which again, in my view, is simplistic because it amounts to just counting how many players you have at each of those layers.
Thank you very much, Thibault. And just before we move on to the next part of the conversation, Karen, I want to just turn to you, and I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but you spoke a little bit about the work that the CMA's done, and you've heard the interventions from Cecilia and Thibault. The CMA has highlighted, I think, in their work, some of the risks to the competition. Do you think the recent developments have changed those risks? Do you still see, as you look forward, that there are potential risks out there to competition in this space?
Thanks, Richard. Happy to make a few brief comments on this. I think just listening to this fascinating bit of the conversation here, you can really hear some of the nuance around this, the different ways of conceiving of scenarios, and then there'd be questions about how would you know which scenario you're in. I think we've sort of skirted around a little bit the idea of tipping, and what that might take, and some of the underpinning economics and dynamics and feedback effects and so on and so forth. All I would say on that, just for the purpose of today, is that this general space, of course, it's very complex and it is evolving rapidly, and it is broad-based and there are impacts across sectors. I think from the CMA's perspective, we have case teams who go deep in building out the understanding of specific markets for specific purposes and needs. And there are then, of course, potentially wider concerns around tipping and these kinds of dynamics that can only be understood by a fuller picture of AI and digital. And it's really for that reason that we don't stop there with the very deep case-specific, sector-specific look at things. We're really trying to take a whole of ecosystem view. We're building out our capabilities, our technical expertise, and then using that across the waterfront of all of our frontline work and also internally in our operations, and we might touch a little bit on that in the end as well, because there's a big opportunity for agencies like ourselves in that space.
Perfect, thank you very much. Well, let's return as we go to the next bit of the discussion on what authorities should do to the poll results. If we could just see people's view. I remember just reminded the question was sort of how much of a priority it should be. And so, well, interestingly, pretty resounding results. 3% of the room or audience believes it should be little to none. I guess maybe we should have drawn a distinction between little or none. There might be a bit of difference between those two, but clearly, again, very helpfully for the conversation. I promise you these are not rigged. They are genuine polls, but quite helpfully for the next part of the conversation, there is agreement they should be a high priority. So that nicely goes into, well, what should they be doing? And Karen, I'll start with you, and I know you've already given quite a lot of the discussion about what the CMA has done in the space and will do going forward, but maybe just quickly, sort of, what is the forward-looking for the CMA over the next sort of few years in response to maybe some of these concerns?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just set it quickly in the context of our sort of wider work and where we've been over the years, because I think that's you'll see in that I think some of the logic for the forward path as well. Because for us, really, I think our strong interest in algorithms really began a number of years ago now. We published research on pricing algorithms back in 2018, and that itself was a really interesting look at considerations around use of algorithms for pricing, both the risk but also the opportunities. There can be many benefits from that as well. But we did a broader piece in 2021 where we looked at algorithmic systems and some of the considerations, noting that even back then, algorithms already were quite integral to many firms and really a growing element of how they operated. As I say, algorithms can bring benefits, lower costs, lower prices possibly, and they can help all of us match more strongly in a more targeted way to products and services, reduce frictions around that, and get our needs met more effectively. But of course, there can also be some risks, important and interesting risks. And to mention just one, possibly more coordinated outcomes, higher prices when algorithms are being used for pricing, and there's a really important literature around this, which is still evolving and has sort of delineated different ways that this can manifest, right through to uses of Gen AI potentially in this space, and some of the scenarios there that can arise, some interesting simulations in the literature. In 2022, our horizon scanning picked out foundation models, of course, is a particularly striking development. A striking emerging technology with this enormous potential that we've been hearing about. And this prompted a deeper dive for us. So we started internally really with some particular focus, building out expertise and capabilities in that space, making sure that we would be ready to help the UK to capitalize on the opportunity when the time arrived. And then we built on that, going back a year or so ago, with our work to review foundation models, our initial review of foundation models, looking at the risks and opportunities from a competition consumer perspective. And then now to today, we're now considering AI's impact across the breadth of our work. And this includes through the lens of the new digital markets competition regime, which came into force at the start of this year. And so this regime, it's really designed to enable us to promote competition in these very fast-moving, complex digital markets while protecting UK consumers and businesses from any unfair or harmful practices, as I say, by the very largest technology firms. It allows us to designate just a very small number of firms as having strategic market status, a very high bar in a particular activity. I won't get into the details, but then rather than imposing blanket rules in that space for those businesses, we take a very tailored, bespoke approach. I talked about proportionality, to identifying and addressing specific issues, working with the businesses themselves, as well as the broader stakeholders from the relevant digital ecosystem. So this is really about an iterative, participative approach and process. And then specifically in relation to AI, this could include assessing some of the firm's activities under this regime in relation to critical inputs as discussed for developing AI or possibly applications downstream and some of the critical access points and gateways and routes to market, distribution that you might think about there. I don't want to speculate about forward work in this space or remedies or anything like that, but suffice to say, I think the regime, it's by its design, it's very much about unlocking opportunities. It's opportunities for the entire ecosystem across the UK tech sector, benefiting companies of all shapes and sizes, along with the investors who back them. And it's really about helping people and businesses across the UK as well, who really rely on access to these critical digital markets day to day to get a fair deal and hopefully a good, really excellent outcome. And so in the forward look as well, we're continuing, thinking back to our work in 2018 and then 2021, the panoramic across algorithmic issues, we're continuing to focus on that broader landscape too. So it isn't all about foundation models. We are striking a balance there too. We're considering, for instance, issues like algorithmic collusion, which I mentioned. When we look at those issues, we do see that they're increasingly supported by both theory and evidence. And they potentially compound, as I say, with the rise of some of these newer, more powerful AI technologies, the wealth of data that might be available to support that pricing prediction challenge. And so we've suggested that firms should be aware of the risks and they should take steps to mitigate them. And we are continuing ourselves internally to actively screen markets for issues like this. So what do I mean by that? So this is about ensuring that we have at our fingertips the technical capability to really invest algorithmic systems, to screen markets as needed, and actually using AI in some cases, and certainly large and novel data ourselves in our work to detect issues. I know you didn't want to get heavily into that at this point. But just to mention one area as well there, under the broad heading of cartelization and collusion, we're currently working with the UK government on something really important, analysing data, using some of our data science, some of our tools to detect bid rigging in public procurement. This is a significant share of overall public spend. It's known to be vulnerable to collusion, and so the public savings could be really significant. At any point in time, this is an opportunity. At this particular point in time, of course, this is a valuable pursuit. And maybe I'll touch a little bit more on some other examples of our use of data later.
Well, I'm hesitant to cut you off. It's very interesting, but I guess let's give the other panelists a chance to answer the question. I think clearly there's a lot going on at the CMA. Sort of they've taken the time to understand the sector. They're monitoring the sector. They're looking forward. They've undertaken the studies. Thibault, Cecilia, you not at an authority, so you've got an opportunity to sort of, from the outside, look in and say what should be doing, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what you think the priority should be, and then I'd like you to sort of hone in on if one thing authorities could do. So, Thibault, Cecilia.
So, before answering the question, I will take the liberty to say that I believe that, of course, regulation is necessary. I would also consider regulation together with taxing these companies. Every time we speak of regulating big tech companies, regulating not only the uses of AI, but also the producers of AI, I think we need to add that discussion into, let's say, a broader analysis. And in that broader analysis, I think that we need to go beyond regulation. And the problem that we are facing is that sometimes the discussions about regulation are taking place in a room full of people that care about competition and market authorities and their role. Then we have another space where taxing is discussed, sometimes also here at the OECD, but with other people. And then we also have a third space where industrial policy is discussed. And this third space, we can frame it as industrial policy, but actually it's about building an alternative and who should lead that alternative, for whom, for what. It's true that AI can bring benefits, but also AI is being used for weaponry, for surveillance in the workplace, for surveilling citizens. And in part, this is happening because we're not coupling these discussions with a deeper discussion about what type of technology we want, for what, for whom. Is this technology ecologically sustainable? I think that all this needs to be taken into account. It's very hard to answer what the priority should be when I actually think that competition and markets authorities should not only work together among them internationally, but also work together with the other parts of the governments to try to find a solution that is much more comprehensive and that goes way beyond just regulation. But going to the question, and this by no means is a way to escape from the answer. I will answer it. I'm different. I cannot control myself, and I need to answer all the questions. So, so I will answer. And I would say that considering all the things that I've said so far, competition and markets authorities have an opportunity, first of all, to look at all these strategic partnerships among those at the top, to scrutinize what's going on there, and to what extent already with the available tools there is some space for regulation that has been missed. I also think that there is a space to retrofit antitrust or competition authorities by looking at what's going on at the level of the research that is done. The research field in AI has been controlled by, in particular, Microsoft and Google from way before ChatGPT. I've done a lot of work on this, and already between 2018 and 2020, the center of the network of the organizations that were more frequently presenting their work at the major AI conferences, the two nodes that were at the center of the network were Microsoft and Google. And Microsoft actually was the node that was connecting the research that was taking place in China with the research that was taking place in the rest of the world. And this leads me to another point, the geopolitical role that these companies are having. I think that should always be taken into account when we're thinking about regulation and why we want regulation. It's not just because of competition, it's also because of the geopolitical impact that their positioning and these days their association with the US administration in the case of US and more historically with China and Chinese big tech is having.
Yeah, I'm very sorry I started this running gag of not answering your questions, but we are the old-fashioned one on the panel with paper, right? So I thought we were bonding. All right, to answer your question, the one priority which for me should be the one for all the competition agencies all over the world, which is very simplistic, is to look at regulatory barriers. And to be more specific, I would start from the least realistic to maybe the more realistic for competition agencies. The least realistic would be to reassess existing regulations and to ask ourselves the questions, are they hurting open source or not? Because most of the regulations that we have already, that have been around for quite some time, are actually not neutral but biased against open source, which is a very important force if we look at the competitive dynamics in the space. And I mean, it's very easy to conceive. If you have one legal team within a company and products that you deploy, let's say within the EU, it's much easier to control and to be compliant than if you have an open source, truly open source project that is spread all over the world with many different inputs, people from, let's say, Latin America and Asia and Europe and the US contributing to one project where, in fact, it may be much harder to ensure that you are compliant with wherever the model will be used or the technology will be used, right? So I know the European Commission, when it came to smart contract and blockchain, undertook that role of reassessing existing contract law and regulations and private law to see what it means in the context of smart contracts. I think we could do the same for open source. Maybe more realistic would be to be very fearful of regulatory capture in the space. It is not true that all of the companies are arguing against regulations, and in fact, you may see here and there, going to Congress, companies arguing for regulation when they know they're going to be able to comply with the regulation because they can afford that compliance, right? The very last point would be to make competition part of the discussion when it comes to non-competition type of regulations. And here I have one example, which is the AI Act. And most competition agencies will tell you that they actually missed being part of that conversation because they obsessed with the DMA. And of course, the DMA was very central to their work or to the work of the European Commission. But the AI Act also has very strong competitive dynamics and implications because the AI Act is in the same spirit and of the same kind as GDPR, meaning that it applies to every single company as long as you are within the criteria here, whether it's risky or the capabilities approach. This is Article 53 and so on and so forth, right? The AI Act is not like the DMA and the DSA that apply only to big companies or companies with a certain number of users. It does apply to every single company, regardless of whether or not you have 2 employees or 1,000 employees, as long as you deploy a system that is high risk or, again, has very high capabilities. Now, we have empirical research on GDPR applying the same to every company. It was disproportionately much harder for small companies to be compliant with GDPR than it was for large companies. We have research, I'm here quoting research by De Meyer and al., 2024. EU companies, because of GDPR alone, stored 26% less data than US companies and computed less than 15% less data than US companies. In an increasingly digital world, we can all understand how problematic it is. Which is not to say that we do not need GDPR, but which is to say that when it comes to those non-competition kind of regulation, we do want competition agencies to play a role and to say, well, look, wait a minute, maybe what you are doing has a big impact on competition and there is another way of doing so, right? I'm always reminded of the DOJ antitrust case against Microsoft. It took the company over 10 years and 800 employees working full-time on generating the technical documentation related to the operating system, which is not AI-based. The AI Act imposes something similar on every single company as long as they deploy a system that is high risk. And on top of that, mandates that the company will make that technical documentation in line with the EU fundamental rights and explain how they do so. Imagine a startup of 4 to 5 employees being in a position and being required to comply with the AI Act that way. I think, end of the day, those companies are going to have a choice, either to take a chance and not to comply, or if they comply, it will certainly slow them down and potentially will create a barrier to competition. So I think the role for competition agency, and this will be for me my number one priority, should be to be part of the conversation, which is not to say that competition should trump every other concern, such as privacy and security and geopolitics, but you want to make that story heard and be part of the discussion. And so I see very little of that, but I'm hopeful that we'll see more of it in the future.
Thank you, Thibault. And I guess before we move the conversation on to the final part around sort of technology and how authorities might use it, I mean, Karen, we've heard from Cecilia that it's important to break down these silos and that competition needs to talk to other policy areas, and Thibault, very clear that competition should be in the room, I guess, and I think, you know, having heard you earlier, it was clear that the CMA is cooperating domestically as well as internationally. Could you just quickly reflect on sort of, I guess, any lessons the CMA's taken from that cooperation and any advice you'd give to other authorities on how to do that effectively, or maybe sort of challenges in doing that effectively?
Yes, absolutely. And, enjoyed listening to that part of the conversation as well. And, touching there on sort of again, that ecosystem view, thinking about policy objectives. Competition isn't the only policy objective. Consumer protection, we operate in the UK in a legislative framework, but of course we need to be very cognizant of the priorities of our government. We need to be very, cognizant of the wider external, including international context. And really, as you say, I think you put it very well, part of the conversation and a positive force in that conversation, and really looking, we need to deliver our statutory functions, but we need to find ways to support the government and its objectives, and really connect and share perspective and insight with all stakeholders that could include agencies and authorities and regulators in other areas like data protection, where there can be overlap, where there is value to that sharing, particularly in a complex digital space. So I would reflect that it's, I think you talked about lessons. I mean, I think a truth for us that it's very clear to us that it's critical to be engaging across the ecosystem. It's that ecosystem view with a wide variety of stakeholders that make up the AI ecosystem, the focus here. We do this a lot. We have very active, ongoing engagement to better understand the sector, keep pace with developments, and be sharing and testing thinking. This, of course, includes other regulators and authorities in the competition and the consumer protection space, also in adjacent areas where it makes sense to be doing that. I mentioned data protection, there are others, and consumer advocacy groups, academics, think tanks, civil society groups. This is all very important. And crucially, I touched on this already, but it includes businesses and those who would invest in them, large and small, major global firms, challenger startups, both based here, at home in the UK and overseas, and really making sure that we are true to that ecosystem, approach that we're driving. And on the business and investment engagement, I think these days we have a much more open door approach to that at the CMA. We've recently launched a new growth and investment council that bringing together senior leaders from this space across a wide range of UK business and investor representative groups. Some great conversations, really valuable, helping identify opportunities for competition to unlock growth and investment in the UK. And that's sitting around the table regularly and really listening and doing that deeper engagement, that open engagement is something we're very committed to continuing, taking forward from here, including in firms' home markets. And then coming back to regulators and other agencies, we hear a lot the need for regulatory join-up, and you can totally understand that, particularly in a complex space that firms might be looking to navigate like this. And we need to ensure that we've got sufficient consistency between our approaches, avoiding unnecessary burden and complexity. In the domestic context, we have something called the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, maybe familiar to many in the room, and that it brings us together with the Financial Conduct Authority, the Information Commissioner's Office on that data protection piece, and Ofcom, the regulator for communication services. And the DRCF itself has an ongoing AI program, which is a great program. It really enables us to come together in this complex space, collaborate, share knowledge, build that coherence that is needed. And many examples of this, but it might be that we pull down topics like the consumer use and perception of generative AI, AI auditing, AI governance, just sharing that understanding of algorithmic processing that I talked about. We recently set up something called the AI and Digital Hub, a pilot initiative to assist and support tech firms looking to innovate in this space, but navigating cross-regulatory digital matters back home in the UK. And they can access some free and informal advice, including startups and other innovators, at once from across the 4 digital regulators. And then just to come to the international level as well. Of course, that's crucial. These exciting but complex issues, they straddle borders, they don't stay within jurisdictions. And we participate actively in international fora like this one. Thank you very much again. The G7, the ICN, including the Technologist Forum, which was started about a year ago, and which has become an incredibly fertile ground for rich exchange of insight and understanding, specifically in relation to technologies, but also their implications, both our own use of them internally, but also out there in markets. And these are really fantastic platforms for us. We're leveraging one another's skills and experience. Of course, that makes an enormous amount of sense. Everybody has a budget envelope, a resourcing envelope, and we're stronger together on that. And we might then also be able to align on timing and process in some of our enforcement areas, whilst, of course, each jurisdiction retaining sovereignty over decisions. So this is vital.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm a little bit conscious of time, so I think we probably can't delve into all of these interesting areas as much as we might like. But I did want to give a little bit of time for the panelists to explore some of those two other themes that I highlighted at the beginning about how our AI could be interesting to the competition space in terms of how it may affect other markets, but also how it might be utilized by authorities. And Cecilia, I wanted to turn to you first, because you touched on some of these issues in your opening remarks and about how partnerships may not just be limited to within the AI space and could be having effects in other markets. So I guess if you could maybe just give a few minutes to talk us about how do you see AI affecting competition more broadly, if we think even more broadly than the ecosystem that you set out at the beginning?
Absolutely, Richard. So let me start with an example. And again, because we're here in France, I will give you the example of LVMH and Google. Also because I'm on the over 100 interviews that I did specifically on this topic, I interviewed someone from LVMH speaking about the partnership with Google and the other way around. And in this case, of course, LVMH is interested for brand building, but also interested even for identifying in their stores where us as consumers, well, certainly not myself at LVMH's brands, but anyway, how consumers are looking at the products, where they're staring. So the same type of technologies that we see, for instance, on Amazon.com, but applied to the brick and mortar store. And for these and more technologies, they, among others, turned into Google. I say among others because they are also using the strategy of the big tech and nurturing startups that sometimes work for free and showcase their products for free to the brands, but sometimes end up having a contract with LVMH. So we again have this structure of a core company, in this case a company that is not from the tech sector, but that is turning more into digital technologies and AI in particular to run its business, to do brand building, to develop the next trends, to identify and anticipate the trends. And this is the case of LVMH because it's a company that is based on a type of intangible that is brands. But we move to the big pharma, and here we see the use of AI for drug development, the use of AI for clinical trials, and even the use of AI for identifying which are the physicians that are more efficiently prescribing the drugs of each big pharma. This is an example that I got from an interview as well. So all these uses of AI rely on the use of a technology that, of course, these companies, although they are partially developing, they are still partially purchasing on the cloud. So all these companies are migrating to the cloud, which means migrating to Amazon, Microsoft, and or Google, and using technologies without having access to the technology. And this is something that needs to be highlighted. All these other leading corporations, when they are not developing the technology, it's not that Google shares with them the algorithm. It shares a closed service, unless it is open source, which is also used by these companies themselves, by the Microsoft, the Googles, as a sort of bait, as a way to establish a sort of a standard in the industry that then everybody uses. And this is what happened, for instance, with the AI library TensorFlow. So even these companies participate, the big tech companies in the open source space, and even there they're capable of shaping what type of AI and digital technologies other markets are adopting and using. So if we think of this from the larger ecosystemic perspective, what I see is basically what I would call cloud hegemons, the Amazon, Microsoft, and Google on the top, controlling their ecosystems, but also being able to control even other leading corporations. And why I say this, even though an LVMH and Google are both leading corporations, that the knowledge, the intangibles that LVMH has encapsulated are not relevant for Google, whereas the other way around, it does matter and a lot. AI is not only a general purpose technology, it's also becoming a method of invention. It's also even shaping how we ask questions. So the effect of AI is not only in terms of other industries and sectors, but also in terms of every other field and discipline. And it's even shaping what creativity means and who is creative and who is not. So I think that definitely what we are discussing here is not only relevant for those interested in digital technologies and digital markets, but for society at large.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Thibault, I want to move to you now, and I think we are running a little short on time, so maybe to slightly change tack and ask you to talk a little bit about the work I know you've been involved in sort of with computational antitrust and this angle of how authorities themselves might be utilizing the technology of AI and associated tools for their benefit.
Sure. So I've been trying hard not to praise the CMA too many times so far because I've been doing that a lot in the past couple of years, but I'm going to have to now. First, the DRCF, I think, is an excellent initiative, especially if you take the view of regulatory capture, because it is much harder to capture such a body, a network of regulators, than if you were to have just one AI regulator, right? Follow my eyes, because we may have that elsewhere. Now, when it comes to the use of AI by competition agencies, clearly the CMA is leading and showing the way, right? And I give very specific examples, knowing that all of those examples are public. And we, every year at the Stanford Computational Antitrust Project, put out reports in which we ask all of the competition agencies that are part of the project, it's about 70 competition agencies, to tell us what they do in the space, how they use technology, the challenges they encounter, the institutional challenges, technical ones, legal ones, and so on and so forth. So most of what I would say is actually covered in our third report, which was published in June of 2024, which in AI age probably means like 20 years ago, right? So keep that in mind. When it comes to using machine learning to detect collusion on the public procurement, we have Brazil, Colombia, Spain, Singapore, Czechia, and the UK doing that as I speak. Poland is using machine learning to detect abuses in contractual provisions. The ACCC in Australia is using AI to analyze trends in the complaints that they get on their website. And when enough complaints actually converge toward the same trends, then they actually consider that and may open an investigation. Taiwan is using regression analysis to forecast the effect of mergers. This is the whole body of literature on merger simulation. The UK, again, Catalonia, Denmark are creating networks to spot common ownerships with all of the antitrust implications that it may have. Poland, Singapore, and again the UK are detecting fake reviews online, which again, if you look at increasing returns, could be a very good ways to actually attract consumers and attract more because of those fake reviews and eventually have the market tipped. The Saudi Competition Agency is using AI to automate market definition analysis. Colombia, the Netherlands are using AI to detect collusion in the news, in newspapers, right, and so on and so forth. So we have a lot of agencies being very active as I speak. In fact, all of the agencies that are part of the network, again, it's about 70 competition agencies, are using technology and AI in one shape or the other. Now we have very small competition agencies with less than 10 employees. They also use technology. Of course, they don't have the same capacity as big or bigger agencies such as the CMA, the FTC, the European Commission, but all of them are doing it, which I think is good news because it makes enforcement and policymaking more synchronized to what's happening on the market, right? Lawyers have been complaining for a very long time that they lag behind the technology, and technologists have been saying, well, imagine a world in which the lawyers are way ahead and we rely on lawyers to innovate, right? Well, with those tools, you can actually make it real time, which I think is exactly what we need in the space. Now, when it comes to generative AI and the use of Gen AI by competition agencies, well, we'll see in the report that we hope to publish in June of next year, well, 2025. Already what we know is that Finland is using generative AI to spot potential issues and to help when it comes to other other agencies within the countries having competition questions. They use AI to generate answers to those agencies and to put competition on the table. We know that the French competition agency is using a French technology, Albert, to pronounce it the American way, because why not? It's a French LLM that is only available and used by public officials in France. And they are using it, I mean, they have not disclosed too much, but allegedly to detect practices. So they are not using that on the documentation sent by the parties, but on data that is already available out there. The Netherlands, it's a very amusing case study. They have used, and it's public information, ChatGPT, not to name it, when a big company filed something like 700-page document the day before going to court. The agency was a bit annoyed, and so put that document to ChatGPT, asked for a 3-page summary, and resubmitted that to the court, telling the court that it has been ChatGPT generated, and the court accepted that 3-page summary as the document in the context of that litigation and rejected the large one. That's an amusing one, but you could be creative. And we expect way more, of course, in our report. So it seems that competition agencies, despite the very simplistic way that, well, they are outdated, old-fashioned, lagging behind, are actually not lagging behind when it comes to the use of that technology, which, by the way, also comes with very interesting legal challenges. Because what if a competition agency can compute a lot of data and face a company that is not a digital company and can do none of that? What do we do? Standard of proof, procedural fairness, the right of defense. So this is work for all of us, the lawyers in the room. We have a lot to do in the space, and I think for that reason, that's very exciting.
Thank you very much, Thibault. And Karen, I hand to you. I think probably must apologize for giving Thibault the opportunity to steal your thunder in a few areas. I guess anything to add on what the CMA is doing to use these technologies to help its work, and maybe in a few minutes, given we're running a little short on time.
Thanks, and that was a great tour, and fascinating the work that's going on. I mean, thank you for your kind remarks about the CMA and our team, which is excellent. It's also the case that I think, like any authority, we recognise the challenge to keep pace. This is a constantly evolving space. You have to approach this with some humility as well, and some prioritization, and really, really underpinning for me, because I'm an economist by background. I'm interested in that stuff on the side. There's a sort of a decision theoretic approach you need to be thinking about. You've got to be thinking end to end, not just using the technology, but wherefore, and ultimately what is the impact we're looking to achieve? What would be, if it's about supporting decisions and you would be relying on something as an input, then what is the loss function over the errors? Because there'll be type 1, type 2 errors, and you get into this quite interesting space. But, more prosaically, I would, recognize the challenge. I think it's a massive, massive opportunity. And it's a privilege to be in that space as well. We need to be understanding what's going on in markets, all of the technology there, exploiting all the same advances in technology internally to maximize our efficiency and effectiveness. And this all requires a lot of capability. There's also a really big, and you sort of hinted at this, a really big synergy across the two. And so we've made a significant investment in the space at the CMA. We've been building a dedicated capability since 2019. This has been pivotal in helping us meet some of the complex case investigations, the challenges that come up on the digital side, kind of just around that understanding and, think some of the work you mentioned, as well as driving more proactive work on themes like AI, also online choice architecture, blurring into AI these days as well. And I talked about the synergy. So we recently formed, from an org design perspective, which is my career in an older life as well. I think it's interesting, to think about how you set yourselves up for this. We recently took the step to form a new executive directorate to really consolidate and centralize our capability and expertise across all of this and get the most out of it. So we have now a really exciting mix of skills all in one sort of enlarged unit: data scientists, data engineers, technologists, experts in AI, behavioral scientists. We heard a wonderful keynote this morning from Kathleen Voss, about, which made me immediately start thinking as well about AI agentic systems, which we won't have a chance to go into here, but perhaps over a cup of coffee with interested folks later, because that's a fascinating and emerging area. But we've also got the people that handle our own stack and make sure that that's fit for purpose today, but also evolving to meet the needs of tomorrow. And then, interestingly, I think alongside this, one of the steps we've taken is to integrate into the same group experts in strategic business and financial analysis, because it's not just about understanding technology and the economics around the technology. You also need to be understanding the real-world strategies and business models of those who would be developing this technology, deploying this technology in digital sectors, in non-digital sectors, including in relation to AI, digital ecosystem strategies, and all of that in service of really, looking for the opportunity, looking to support unlocking of the opportunity. And I talked about that deep engagement with business and investors. So we've got this highly interdisciplinary group. We've got a great capability, but we need to stay on our toes and continue to evolve it, invest, but stay prioritized and focused. And we've been applying it a lot internally as well to support our productivity and effectiveness. And, a couple of examples, but you've covered, a really healthy selection as well. So I won't recap those, but, scanning the market for mergers, a mergers intelligence tool to enhance our ability to detect mergers early, do that triage around that and reduce some of the costs of monitoring, automated horizon scanning for technologies themselves. So AI on AI, if you like, and just, keeping up with what's going on there. And then, of course, there's still this critical role in all of this for the humans, because, a great decision, it's about some computation, some prediction, but also, an element of judgment as well. So who is framing up the objective function? Who is thinking about the decision to be taken and how this is going to flow into the work of the CMA, a really important thing to be thinking about. And then just one last example. I mentioned the screening for cartels, and you touched on it too. There we think that this is, important to continue to build out, and we are, carrying out work where data are available. We're working with our government in the UK to consider together and help strategize around data collection in this space. So there's lots going on. Agentic's really interesting as well. Happy to chat about that over a cup of tea.
Thank you very much. I think we are unfortunately running out of time, because I think we'd love to delve into some of these topics more. But I mean, we've heard a lot of, I think, really thought-provoking comments. We saw at the beginning that the room was relatively optimistic, but at the same time, the feeling was that authorities should be focusing on generative AI. We've heard some thoughts for caution from the panel, particularly from Cecilia. Thibault has told us that we must focus on increasing returns to scale. We've heard about the work the CMA is doing. We've heard about how the technology is being used and how we must think about sort of open source, barriers to entry, regulatory barriers, but also being lots of cooperation between authorities domestically, but also internationally. I want to open up the floor to questions. Please raise your hand. We've got a question down here at the front. Someone with the microphone. You just keep your hand raised so they know. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the discussion on the panel. I just wanted to raise one thing. 2.5 weeks ago, Vice President Vance delivered a much expected speech here in Paris at the AI Action Summit. And he very diplomatically, yet very forcefully, told us European laggards that we should reconsider our digital regulation. There is a new sheriff in town, he said a couple of days later in Munich. Now, I'm not hearing much of this here on your panel. Isn't this reflected in your thinking yet? And aren't the United States still a contributing member to the OECD? And that's, I think, the question I wanted to ask you.
I guess the first part of that question, how do you see, I mean, you touched a little bit on the geopolitics. Cecilia, do you want to touch on your views onto how this factors into your thinking?
Sure. I mentioned a few things. I mean, of course, when we were touching upon so many things, I didn't have the time to expand on it. So thank you for the question. Because I truly think that this is a question that, as I was saying before, goes way beyond competition and markets authorities. What we're discussing here is digital sovereignty and ultimately sovereignty. because without digital sovereignty, there is no space for sovereignty. And discussing sovereignty in a global world, in an international world, which means that it's not a yes or no question, but a matter of degrees, and how we can think at the same time of a solution that combines, if you want, digital protectionism, so the capacity of a sovereign state and its people, its population, to decide what type of data should be harvested, how, why, who should get access to that, but at the same time combine these forms of digital protectionism with what I would describe as technological internationalism. I think that the best way to face a Trump administration, this new ruling coalition of the world, that it's open to everyone, but to be fully honest, big tech companies have been sitting on the ruling board for some time now. And if we go back to the NSCAI report, which was a report recommending on the investments on AI for the US Department of Defense, this came out, I think it was 2020 or 2021, and these companies were already stating that the US government should invest a lot on AI because the real threat was China, not them. So they are constantly using the geopolitical circumstances to create a sort of shield or barrier and get those who are in the administration in the US as their defenders. What we see now is a situation where clearly they're operating together. At the same time, the way I see the big tech companies becoming closer or openly saying that they support Trump is also a reaction to the regulations that, among others, were taking place in Europe. It's true that they were not enough, but all these regulatory transformations that were on the way led them to become more tightly aligned with the Trump administration. What is sad is that instead of going one step further and trying to really enforce what's out there and go beyond regulation to really create an alternative, what I have seen in this last couple of weeks or in 2025 from the European Commission, it's far from enough. The other way around. I think that we must, because in the end of the day, it's not that I think that states are the only ones that should bring a solution, but I think that citizens at large should make states responsible for bringing a solution that it's good for the planet and also good for people and the population. So yes, I mean, this puts us under a turning point, and let's see what happens. I wish that everyone embraces a project of what I would describe as reclaiming digital sovereignty for people and the planet. Unfortunately, again, I'm not seeing sufficiently of that at the EU level and still not globally either.
Thibault, Karen, did you want to respond or should we?
I'll be very quick. I may have an op-ed coming in a French newspaper very soon on that, and the way I pitched the op-ed was to say, I doubt you have published this point of view so far, because I would say that a lot of what we hear is that we need sovereignty at the EU level coming from the EU. And of course, we all understand that we don't want to be the vassals of any other great power elsewhere in the world, right? I think we all agree on that. Now, the question is, can we afford to be sovereign, or can we reach sovereignty on our own? And looking at the increasing returns, once again, I doubt it. And you know what? I also doubt that the US can be sovereign on their own, because the dynamics when it comes to those technologies, even if you combine our two markets, pretty much 350 million people, 400 million on the other side of the Atlantic, compared to others such as China, where it's like more than 1 billion, I think on the long haul, it is very unlikely that we can resist the technological improvements that will come out of those jurisdictions if we are not to team up. And the solution may be to say, well, in that case, all we need to do is then to prohibit the models or the AI that comes from jurisdictions that we don't like. I'm always uneasy with that, because if you look at the historical roots of sovereignty, there is the concept of being superior, which makes me very uneasy to say that we need sovereignty because of that primary reason. But also, if you look at over time, our ability to ban technology, and this has been documented by the futurist Kevin Kelly, it has shown that those bans and prohibitions on technology, they tend to be shorter and shorter when we progress, right? So long story short, what it means is that even if we are to ban a model, let's say DeepSeek, because it was trained with data that we don't like and because it is infringing on copyright, allegedly, it could probably be effective for a couple of years at most. But on the long haul, I doubt that the ban will be effective. And so if we are to compete and to look at the quality of the product, I think we have no choice but to team up with the United States, regardless of whether or not we like the administration, because if we don't, I think we're not going to be sovereign, and the technology we're going to have to use is not the one that we think we can use right now.
Okay. Thank you. So slightly contrasting views. I mean, Karen, unfortunately we've run out of time, so last word to you, if you'd like it, to just comment on this issue. How do you see this impacting? Does it impact the space? Is it something that you have to take into consideration as an authority?
Of course, we need to be, very cognizant of, all the full context, the richest context. I would say that this, as the CMA, of course, we're really focused on the outcomes for UK consumers, businesses, and the UK economy. That's our statutory duty. We are looking for ways to contribute, actively to the government's priorities, get behind the AI opportunity and really unleash and unlock that. We enjoy strong working relationships with our US counterparts, and we will continue to collaborate with them on competition and consumer matters, including in the digital space, and this will take the form of ongoing bilateral engagement, as well as very active from our side, enthusiastic participation in multilateral fora like this one. I mentioned the ICN and the Technologists Forum there as well, invaluable for this work.
Thank you very much. And I must apologise to those in the room because we have run out of time. I'm sure you had other questions. Just before you go for a quick break, we will reconvene at 4:30. Can you please join me in thanking the panelists? I hope you agree it's been a very thought-provoking discussion. Thank you. And as I say, back here at 4:30 for the final session of the day on cross-border mergers.